Well, good evening, Bible nerds. Glad to have you back. We got a couple more weeks in Numbers to wrap this up, and then we hit Deuteronomy. I encourage you to stay to the end. Deuteronomy might be something of a rehashing of a lot of material that we've already discussed, but Moses puts it in such a way that it definitely creates something of an eclectic spin on the story that's led all the way up from Exodus to that point, um, and definitely tells it in a way that gives some additional theological insight that we didn't have. If you've noticed along the way, a couple of weeks here and there, I've kind of stolen some passages from Deuteronomy to add some additional clarification. Tonight won't be an exception to that. We'll have a spot to look at, and we are having the additional lens of Moses' perspective from Deuteronomy on the event that happened some 40 years earlier will definitely help clarify and make some things a little clearer for us. So anyway, having said that, what we have seen happen up to this point in the book, first 10 chapters, was really just gearing up to leave Sinai. They hadn't left yet. It's not until chapter 11 that we see the chronology of the book is still a little skewed. And we remember an important thing when trying to manage the Torah is that we don't keep things from the perspective of needed a mama to go out there and wrangle them. That's right. Anyway, we don't keep things in perspective from a chronological rendering. Most of it is in sequence as far as we can tell, but we do definitely get some tidbits here and there that show us that this material has been arranged in such a way that it might be out of sequence, but it's marching to the beat of the theological drummer who's wanting to make sure that we're understanding the story is sewn together the way that it is to tell us a lot more of the deeper principle behind what's at work and play. All right. So anyway, Numbers 10 and 11 is that transition period where we're actually moving away from Sinai, got all the final instructions that we need to tear down the tabernacle, make sure we're handling the holy things the right way. When we set up camp, when we need to, the tabernacle gets set up. This is how the whole camp's going to be arrayed. Remember to keep things holy because God, of course, is going to be living in the camp. He's going to be walking around amongst his people, and in the moment infractions happen, and of course people begin to treat holy things in a common or profane way, God is going to make sure that they understand and remember that he is holy. He is to be revered. And that actually will come to resurface again tonight as a principle with Moses himself directly. And then after that, we jump into the middle of the book where we have 7, go figure, it's favorite number of just about every biblical author we get numbers from, 7 rebellions that tie together the center of the book, and we're still marching through those. And so we're actually going to be looking at our smallest section of chapters tonight because chapter 27 and 36 actually kind of bookend the same thing with the respect of a legal case or matter and the inheritance of daughters, Zelophads to be precise. And so considering the fact that it bookends that chunk of chapters, even though it's quite a bit to deal with, we're going to work through that in our final week. And then off to Deuteronomy. So anyway, let's get started with this. A handful of slides, but we got a lot to swim through. So Numbers 20, if you've got your Bible open, we're going to read the first 13 verses. And we're going to read a lot of this chapter, so just be mindful. The entire Israelite community entered the wilderness of Zen in the first month, and they settled in Kadesh. So just as a reminder, where we have visited Kadesh before in the past is Numbers 13 and 14. If there was something I was going to stick to my brain as goes a particular geographical spot other than Sinai or Canaan from this book, it's Kadesh or Kadesh Barnea, depending on how it's termed in certain passages. And the reason why is because a lot of the story happens there. It's a very pivotal point in the story. It's where they broach the southern border of Canaan. It's where they rebel and just outright reject the Exodus. And it's where they're going to spend a lot of their time in waiting, just eye-shot away from the land itself until a whole generation of people die. And nearly 38 years will pass before they actually pick up stakes and move on. Or so that seems to be the more favored rendering from Numbers 33 and all the camp stops from Sinai all the way up to the wilderness of Zen, Kadesh Barnea, and then when the story picks up again, they start to move to the staging area that Joshua is going to take them from. And so it seems like they really haven't done much traveling in that 38-year time period. Anyway, finishing verse 1, Miriam died and was buried there. And in 5 short words, it just seems like this is almost a biphrase. Nothing significant to that because we just move on. Death is a part of life for us. We don't really spend a lot of time thinking through that when we encounter that in the story, but this is hugely important because of the trifecta of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. She's the first of them to die. And of course, it's a time of mourning for the community at large. She's the first and only one that we have record of in the whole nation of Israel. And now their legacy passed to be termed a prophetess. No one is going to carry that name again until we get into the Judges era with Deborah. So this is hugely important. Verse 2, there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us from Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain, figs, vines, and pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. So they're reminding him that they have fallen short of what? With those terms that we read in that verse right there, if they had everything that they just listed out to Moses that they don't have, they would be firmly settled in what kind of environment? Think about it. Grain. What's that? They'd be in Canaan. But what kind of environment does this describe? When you've got Eden. They're not in Eden yet. And yet again, they want to lay this charge on Moses that he's the one that's failed to bring them there. So again, this is a theme, a thread that pretty much pieces together just about every one of these 7 movements of rebellion in which this is called out. In fact, last week we looked at Korah basically saying, look, you took us from a land flowing with milk and honey and have yet to deliver us into a land flowing with milk and honey, and creating this paradigm that's going to permeate the rest of the biblical narrative that Egypt is where their hearts have always been. Their hearts have never really been traveling toward the promised land, the new provincial Eden space that God has promised them. And when they do finally get there, sometime later, it's going to start to sour in their mind, and they're going to want to try to turn this place into a new Egypt. But I digress. Anyway, verse 6, then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, take the staff and assemble the community, you and your brother Aaron, are to speak to the rock while they watch. Notice that. You and your brother Aaron. So Aaron is not necessarily charged with having to say anything. Moses has been doing all the speaking for himself now for quite some time, for decades. And so with that in mind, what we're supposed to see here is that this is an echo of what begins for us in Exodus chapters 3 and 4, when Moses, as he's talking to the angel of the Lord in front of the burning bush, is insistent upon, I'm not going. There just has to be somebody else in some other way. And so as part of the accommodation, God gives him who? Aaron. And for the rest of the story, we just become accustomed to seeing Moses and Aaron as something of a duo in a lot of sequences. A lot of sequences, Moses is acting and speaking all on his own. He comes back into the limelight, and it's important that we understand why, because from the get-go, it seems like this was something more or less as an accommodation to what God never originally intended. It was really supposed to be Moses who was going to be the king-like leader of this people, who is going to be the face and representative of God toward them, speaking his word with prophetic authority, and of course interceding as a priest in many ways, not necessarily counting or taking into account the sinful moments of rebellion when Israel needed this intercession and it wasn't planned or staged on the Lord's part for Moses to be the intermediate between he and God. To clear that up a bit, consider Leviticus chapters 8 and 9. When Aaron is being installed into the priesthood, he can't serve as an intermediate. He's not a legitimate priest at this point. So Moses is the one who's having to offer the sacrifices, anoint everything. He's the one who is granted a special dispensation or allowance to touch holy things that only priests get to, because there are no real priests at that point. So that's all planned by the Lord. But now that Aaron is going to have to serve in this role that it seems like Moses may have forfeited. Moses may have been the one that would have worn the sacred garments and been the new consecrated Adam figure. Because certainly, I hope if I've done a decent enough job at it, what we've seen in weeks past is that Moses and Aaron kind of team up and share this role of being a new consecrated Adam figure. That we've seen, there have certainly been sequences where Moses seems to be the one who is standing there front and center and definitely wearing that role rather obviously. But then, of course, we've got what has been given to Aaron as a special role, and it's all too clear that he is the new consecrated Adam figure also because he gets to walk around in the tabernacle. That's the model of the Garden of Eden. So they're sharing this role, and the same can be said in this chapter. So I think that's important for us to always try to train our brain to keep in mind. So anyway, back in verse 8, you're to speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock, provide drink for the community and their livestock. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock. Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring out water from this rock for you?" Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff, so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I have given them." These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and he demonstrated his holiness to them. Okay, so we've got Moses' rebellion, but first let's make sure that we have in a clear focus what seems to be humming in the background of many of these chapters. Hence, I've got that plastered somewhere in some amalgamation of highlights from the Genesis prologue, chapters 1 through 3 of Genesis, on the screens, because this is what we're supposed to be comparing it to. This is what the author would have appreciated that we already know, and we can understand how the parallels work because this is what we're seeing repeated in some form over and again. So in the Genesis prologue, chapters 1 through 2, man is coronated as king, commissioned as priest, and he is told to rule and serve on the cosmic mountain where the garden temple is. He is to know Yahweh. That means experientially. It's a very odd thing for us to think about, but this word know, in just about every sense it's used in a relational context in the Old Testament, is almost first and foremost the way that a husband and wife know each other intimately in the context of marriage. So how do you translate that into the situation where we are to know God or to know His wisdom? That's how intimately we are to know God and His wisdom. So anyway, man is to know God through his wisdom, and of course, man ultimately rebels. But having said that, Moses at this point has been leading the people as a king. He obviously has mediated as a priest in multiple contexts. He's faulted for not delivering Eden. That's not really his fault, though. A caveat to that would be he has had to deal with the rebellion of the people over and again. If they had been doing their part, they would already be in the new Eden space and would have been for years. Conquest probably would have been over at this point, and they would all have moved on into their tribal allotments and settled down and ready for the next generation to take over. But alas. But what happens here is that just like in the context of the man in Eden, even though they're not there yet, they have been living in this liminal space of kind of a pseudo-Eden because God does walk amongst them. The Mishkan, his dwelling place, the tabernacle, which also doubles as the Ohel Moed, the place or tent of meeting, is fully operational. If they have been in Kadesh for 38 years now, it's been set up for 38 years, and presumably they've been going through the liturgy of recognizing and observing the appropriate feasts and all that. We don't know. We don't have a record of that. Seems like all that time is just kind of skipped over from Numbers 19 on into 20. But nonetheless, because of that, what we are to understand and appreciate is Moses is given the chance here. He is told expressly what to do when he approaches the rock. Both he and Aaron doubling up together as the consecrated Adam figure. So Moses has clear command or Torah, instruction, which is to what? Do a rain dance on the rock? Talk to the rock. Instead, he lets his mouth carry him away to start with by speaking and accusing these people of what is obvious and true. Yes, they're rebels. But then he goes on to say, must we bring water from the rock? That hopefully starts to clear up the statement that comes after this, which may otherwise be quite ambiguous if we don't keep that in mind. Because God says, you failed to demonstrate my holiness. If we're thinking about the fact that holiness means to be set apart, transcendent, above, altogether different than, then what about Moses' action is failing to demonstrate God's holiness? By Moses stepping into the role and saying, we bring water. Who's the one bringing the water? Exactly. So because of that fact, the Lord is responsible for that action, yet Moses is stepping into this position to say that he can achieve something that he ordinarily cannot do on his own apart from God's power. Then that is to, in a way, besmirch God's holiness and fail to recognize the fact that God is holy. And again, it's been a painful lesson that people like Nadab and Abihu, two oldest sons of Aaron, have had to learn the hard way, and others as well, that God's holiness is not to be profaned. And even the great Moses himself becomes a reckless example of what happens when a person fails to observe that. And so in this sense, he has clear instruction, Torah, on what to do. He opts for what seems to be wiser in his own eyes. Accuse these people out of his own frustration, and then to acclaim and tribute something to himself that is not his, which in a lot of ways is very similar to what Adam and Eve are trying to seize for themselves in the garden context. Does that make sense? Hopefully I'm not twisting or contorting that. But anyway, then the next piece we get to is this thing with Edom. There's a lot going on in this chapter, and if we're trying to make sense of how it all connects together, I think one thing that we're going to see in all of this is that there's rejection at the heart of it all. Because now Moses is rejected from the chance to go into the land, and he will address this with the Lord multiple times until God says, enough, do not bring this up to me again. You're not going in. It's that simple. So then in verses 14 through 18, Moses sends messengers from Kadesh into the kingdom of Edom, and they say, playing the whole relationship card, which is right and proper, this is what your brother Israel says, because remember, Edom comes from Esau, and of course, Israel, well, is Jacob. So these two, obviously blood brothers, and there was a feud there, though there was a time for redemption and making up for past transgressions. But nonetheless, these two people seem to split and go their own way, and from the way the story continues to be borne out through the rest of Scripture for centuries that will come after these two nation founders die, there seems to be a little more than animosity between these people. So anyway, this is what your brother Israel says. You know all the hardships that have overtaken us. Our ancestors went down to Egypt. We lived in Egypt for many years. We were treated badly. And we cried out to the Lord. He heard our plea. He sent an angel. He's brought us up out of Egypt. Now look, we are here in Kadesh, a city on the border of your territory. So please, let us travel through your land. We won't travel through any field or vineyard or drink any well water. We will travel the King's Highway. This is where Bible maps do a lot to help. Because if we're looking at this from the perspective of the Dead Sea, then Kadesh is like down here. This whole territory right here is Edom, and the King's Highway goes right across to get them over here so they can start the staging process. How easy is that? But guess what happens? Edom sends out an answer. No, you can't. Maybe a little bit of a negotiational plea there, but it's, of course, reinforced with men in arms, full-clad armor, all that stuff, coming out to the furthest western edge of the border to make it crystal clear you do not have the option to pass through. But what does God do? He allows for that. He does not tell them, well, hey, because they're being belligerent then, you just go ahead and I'll handle this. Instead, he tells them to turn back toward the way of the Red Sea, and they we'll find this out in later passages. Go all the way down to a city called, or a settlement at least, Ezion-Geber, which is literally right there at the tip of the Red Sea. So they're going to have to go all the way down here, pass by the southern border of the land of Edom, and go all the way up this way. This is hundreds of miles. This is months' worth of needless walking if these people would just simply have a heart, but it isn't going to work out that way. So people of Esau refused to help their brother, and maybe, in a sense, the rejected brother, Esau, kind of gets a chance to repay the slight paid him so many years earlier, although that man is dead and gone. Maybe that's part of what fuels the animosity on the part of the Edomites, Esau's people, in the way that they constantly seem to deal with Israel in her story. But nonetheless, I put that in red because, again, down at the bottom of the Genesis prologue, the man rebels and is exiled. Esau is not a stranger to Yahweh, the God of his ancestors. The same one that Jacob worships is the same one that Isaac and Abraham, who he is a son and grandson of. The Edomites will not be worshipers of Yahweh for the most part, but nonetheless, they know the story, or one would think. And so with that in mind, I'm sure they have a familiarized understanding of the creational context, and they have the chance here to opt for wisdom, to partner with God and show charity toward family, to complete strangers if they were called upon to do so, but they refuse. They instead let their vengeance seemingly get the better of them. And then toward the end of this chapter, verses 25 through 29, we see the death of Aaron. So this chapter is bookended with the death of Moses' two siblings. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar, although Miriam seemingly was not planned, this one is, and bring them up Mount Hor. Remove Aaron's garments. So that's over here. Mount Hor is like right there. Take the garments from him. So it would seem like Aaron is going to be outside of the precincts of the tabernacle on a very rare occasion, because this is not supposed to happen. He's supposed to wear those when he's inside the precincts of the tabernacle complex, and put them on his son Eleazar. Aaron will then be gathered to his people, a euphemistic phrase, a nicer way of saying he's going to die. So Moses did as the Lord commanded. They climbed Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. After Moses removed Aaron's garments, put them on his son Eleazar, Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. The whole community saw Aaron had passed away, and they mourned him for 30 days. Again, we would just probably pass over this in a blasé sort of way and be like, yeah, okay, so now he's old, he's dead and gone. It's Eleazar's turn. But we should be asking questions, as we should of every Bible passage. Why on a mountain? I mean, this is flat territory in most places, and this probably in the mountain in the same context or sense that you and I would think of a mountain. Nonetheless, why all the trouble of having an aged and dying man walk all the way up a mountain to then just die and then have to carry his carcass back down if they didn't bury him on top of the mountain? This just seems like nonsense. But if we consider the meta-narrative of Scripture, hence the Genesis prologue, the first consecrated king-priest ruled where? In a garden on a mountain. So here, they're not in the land yet, but the baton's got to be passed. So here we have the one who is chosen as the successor, the third eldest son, who is going to follow up there with him, and literally in the ceremonial exchange of taking garments off, putting garments on to signify in front of everybody, he's the new consecrated Adam figure coming down from the mountain. It's the whole ancient temple cosmogony concept in play here with respect to the idea of passing the baton, but it's all happening on a high place, a mountain, which seems to constantly be reverberating in the background of most of these stories in Scripture. So does that kind of make sense? But we see here at the same time that Aaron too has been rejected. Now, one question we might want to ask is, when Moses was over there yelling at people and not speaking to the rock, but instead speaking to people and slapping rocks, why does Aaron get punished? We have no record of Aaron doing anything. I mean, he's not over there trying to wail away with his staff on the rock to make it spew water any faster. Why does he get punished? I think perhaps one of the few, if not only ways we can make sense of this is, again, they are dualistically wearing the hat of the consecrated Adam figure. So when one does something like this, it only makes sense the other one would get punished just the same. Now, that might seem unfair in our eyes, but this is part and parcel, the price to pay for Moses not wanting to do the job entirely, Aaron having to be brought into this, and he's not an innocent figure. I mean, Exodus 32, we've seen what he's capable of. But nonetheless, we have no idea what was going on in the background either. We're trying to reimagine this scenario forensically, and we only see Moses speaking and acting. It seems like, well, Aaron gets a raw end of the deal in this. But he's understood for the last near 40 years that he and Moses both. Remember the time last week when we were talking about Miriam and Aaron both coming to Moses? Does God only speak through you? Don't think so, mister. You know, what's that about? So he's definitely had his moments of touch and go here and there, and he's had to bear punishment out at times for how he's spoken against the Lord and rebelled. So it's not, I think, a surprising shock to see that he would suffer this in this moment. But anyway, all good here? Makes sense? Rejection, bad thing, and we're seeing it starting to pay its dividends. All right, so Numbers 21. Here we go, just taking a step forward and 2 steps back. We'll read the first 3 verses. When the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming on the Athiram road, he fought against Israel, captured some prisoners. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord, if you will hand this people over to us, we will completely destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's request and handed the Canaanites over to them, and Israel completely destroyed them in their cities. So they named the place Hormah. And in this moment, you're like, about time? My goodness, all the struggles that you've went through in rebelling and kicking against God like petulant children, and finally, you get on the same sheet of music as Him. And yet again, you've had a moment where God has allowed you to clearly see this is what happens when you partner with God. So, looking at this from the perspective of the Genesis prologue, changed some of that up a bit. Keeping the fact that man is to know God through his wisdom, his Torah, he says, you're free to eat from any tree, but you cannot eat from the tree of Tov and Ra, good and bad. It's a source of wisdom. It's a wisdom I want you to have in time, but it's a wisdom I defined. It's not a wisdom that you seize on your own in an attempt to redefine and then cut me out of the picture. That's in Genesis 2, anticipating what's about to happen in Genesis 3. So, considering that, let's take a look at Israel's past precedent with battle. So remember that scenario before they even make it to Sinai. Amalek shows up, attacks them, completely unprovoked out in the wilderness. God made a special purpose to not lead them along the way of the sea, north out of Egypt, to go by the way of the land of the Philistines, because He didn't want them to encounter battle. But here comes Amalek, this wandering desert nomad tribe that just likes to raid everybody that comes their way and act like locusts and just consume. And they engage Israel. And then we got this weird battle with, as long as Moses is doing this, Israel's winning. As long as Moses is doing this, they start to lose and Amalek prevails. They learn that victory is achievable when they recognize that Yahweh, God, fights for them. It's not them through their own prowess and resources, right? But then we have the events of Numbers 13, 14, when everybody's like, we hate you, Moses. You're horrible. Going to stone you because you have failed us in every sense of the word, and we're going to just go back to Egypt and we want to be slaves forever because we love Egypt and everything there was way better than what you have given us, or better yet, God through you. And then after they have a good night's rest on it, they wake up the next day and Moses is like, what are you doing? Why are you strapping on swords and picking up shields? Well, we realized we were wrong. We acted a little too hastily, so we're going to go into the land. We're ready for battle. I don't know what good you think that's going to do because God is not going to go ahead of you. And they face the Amalekites along with the Canaanites again, and they lose bad. So they experience defeat because, like the garden, they chose what was wise in their own eyes, rejecting the Exodus, not trusting that God, who fought for them with Amalek, is now going to turn all of these peoples over to them for their complete annihilation. Now we get into this particular predicament. Now, one particular question that we should be asking is, man, where is this even happening at? And why? Why does the king of Arad even want to go pick a fight? Because he is like right around here. And why does he just want to go up to Israel and say, you best be stepping? But then doesn't even give them a chance to do that. He just goes and starts picking a fight with them. And then as part of this conflagration, prisoners are taken. So there's going to have to be another military exchange here to get prisoners back. So part of this is because, again, this is where they're at. They've moved a little bit in this easterly direction, trying to get to Edom, but Edom is not going to let them pass. But while that's going on, and remember, nobody was dialing cell phones, so it takes time to get from there to Mount Seir, presuming that's where the capital and the king is ruling from, in Edom, and then to send emissary back, and then send his guard and armed forces out there too. So while all this is going on, news from spies gets up to this guy wearing a crown, and he's like, oh no, you're not coming through my land either, and he preemptively strikes. So that's why this is going on, is because they're still there. They haven't started migrating south yet to walk around Edom, okay? And we know this because once we look at Deuteronomy chapter 2, we get Moses' perspective, because he's about to say that, look, After this is over with, then we turned back and headed for the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. The Lord told me we've traveled around the hill country of Seir for many days. Then the Lord said to me, you've been traveling this hill country long enough, so turn north. Command the people, you're about to travel through the territory of your brothers. This is after they get down here and then start turning up in this direction. So Moses gives us the perspective that Numbers doesn't, that it denies us, that they have to walk all the way around Edom, and adds a little bit more to why this actually happened. So I'm not going to read that whole passage. You can do that on your own. Anyway, so now they're caught in this predicament, Canaanite king of Arad. And oddly enough, the people have a moment of clarity. Okay, so we can either do one of two things. This was an unprovoked attack. They've taken some prisoners. We can chalk up the losses. It stinks that maybe men, women, children, all of them, some of them, were taken, but it's part of what happens in scenarios like this. And are their lives worth risking the lives of the countless many more of husbands and so forth that are going to die in combat to get them back? And of course, women who might be taken as part of spoils of war and sold into slavery or raped or whatever else. We can just turn south. And if we turn south and run and get away from them fast enough, then hopefully they won't bother us anymore. Because obviously, we're not going to get the chance to go this way. But they don't. They don't. They're faced with a moment here to embrace wisdom. And what does wisdom tell them to do? Let's talk to the Lord. Lord, if you will hand them over to us. They're Canaanites. What are the Canaanites destined for? Obliteration. They are supposed to be completely annihilated. If you hand them over to us, then we will annihilate them. We won't leave anybody. The Lord shemahs, and he obeys, and he says, okay. And he leads them into battle as their conquering king, and they prevail. Where was that 38 years ago? Why wasn't they thinking like that then? Why did it take this to get them? Okay, enough of that. But then after this, what happens is a stark contrast, and it's almost comedic, but at the same time sad. When we pick up in verse 4 through verse 9, they set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea, so we know they got to be heading south, to bypass the land of Edom. But the people became impatient because of the journey. If we understand this, though, we can imagine why. I mean, any of us as guys, or my wife is a very sensible driver too, thinks the way most guys should when it comes to traveling on the road, so she can certainly relate. Not that kind of person who's like, if my GPS doesn't tell me, I have no idea where I am. That's really more me. But anyway, you're right here. This makes perfect sense. How will they even know? And who cares if they come out and fight us? We just won. So why in the world, right? It's like you're riding that high that comes from victory. We can kick everybody's butt and take names. Why are we going this way, Moses? Well, from Deuteronomy's perspective, who told them to go that way? The Lord. The Lord delivers Torah instruction. You are not to go against them. You are not to conquer them. I have allotted Edom for Esau. That is his special inheritance. It will not become yours. You need to know that. But they get impatient, and of course they start to provoke the Lord again. Verse 5, the people spoke against God and Moses. Why do they always go to this? You have led us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness. There's no bread or water, and we detest this wretched food, the manna. Then the Lord sent poisonous snakes among the people, and they bit them, so that many Israelites died. The people then came to Moses and said, we've sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord so that he will take away the snakes from us. And Moses interceded for the people. The Lord said to Moses, make a snake image mounted on a pole. When anyone who is bitten looks at it, he will recover. So Moses made a bronze snake, mounted it on a pole. Whenever anyone was bitten, he had to but look at the snake and he recovered. We've heard this as the subject of many lessons and sermons. There's a lot I would love to say on this. I would love to take the next hour and walk through the significance of what's going on here with respect to the weirdness, because it's totally odd that God would say of the thing he sent to bite and punish and be the tool of his wrath and judgment to now become the symbol of the thing that's going to deliver salvific healing for them. And so part of this has to do with the type of metal that's used, bronze, and the way from the root word of the Hebrew that's being employed here, nakash, that is also the very same root word of the very English word given to us in Genesis 1. If you remember, way back when we were going through Exodus chapters, I guess 1 through 10, and we were talking about when Moses gets the sign from the Lord at the burning bush, hey, how will they believe that you actually talked to me and sent me? Throw your pole down. What does it become? It becomes a nakash, a serpent. But then when he does the thing in front of Pharaoh, it becomes a tamim. So there are different words for serpent given to us in Hebrew. But that being said, it's nakash in Genesis 3. It's a shining one. So all I would really sum this up as saying at this point is that part of what we're supposed to appreciate from the imagery of this is that this is a callback to a heavenly spiritual entity that's in Genesis 3, hence the prologue, serpent most cunning, who is actively rebelling against God in the garden and enticing the image bearers to rebel right along with him. Now that's interesting because we see Jesus using this very story that falls into complete silence and obscurity for the rest of the Old Testament narrative until we get to John 3, and he's talking to a teacher of Israel who knows this story like the back of his hand, and he's saying, just like the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And all of that comes flooding back to Nicodemus, and we're asking ourselves, okay, well, I see the cross and all of that, but what is it? A heavenly entity coming down to take a curse, because the serpent represents the curse, the only one of the three characters standing before Yahweh in the garden, man, woman, serpent, who receives a curse. He becomes the curse as he is lifted up and enthroned as Israel's king on the cross, and becomes the very tool that is paradoxically receiving God's wrath and at the same time dealing out salvation. I'm not expecting anybody to see that as far as people who are appreciating what's happening right now, living through the events of Numbers 21 in real space and time. Why would we think that they would think that's Messiah? There's no messianic link to that until Jesus brings this up. In fact, I don't know of anybody who in ancient antiquity, Second Temple literary period, writing about that being something Messiah would do until Jesus speaks it. And I'm sure Nicodemus probably thought about that. That probably became the thing of dreams for him in the weeks that ensued, months that ensued, perhaps afterwards. But I digress. Point being is that there's a lot going on here that ties together this story with the Genesis prologue. It might take us all a little bit more time to kind of chew on and digest to appreciate what's happening there. But again, Israel has a moment of clarity, and then they step on the banana peel. So what this does in setting the context back in the frame of the Genesis prologue is we have to dispense with the idea that if Adam and Eve had simply eaten of the tree of life, it would have been a one and done and over with. Because the story that's being built upon that foundation over and over again is this is imbibing of God's wisdom. It is imbibing of God's Torah. That is the first psalm, the whole prologue to basically the second Torah in the Bible, the 5-division book or scroll of the Psalms that speaks of being in the garden, and you've got two paths. The one who doesn't sit or stand or walk with all of these bad characters, but who meditates upon the Torah, the instruction, the wisdom of the Lord, who is like a tree in the garden. It's always making its fruit, leaves never wither, all that wonderful stuff. That it's a constant drinking in of that produces life. If we strictly look at Genesis 1 through 2 in a vacuum, well, Genesis 1 through 3 in a vacuum, and that it's divorced from everything else that comes after it, and if they had just eaten the right tree, then the rest of the biblical story wouldn't have happened. That's not true. That's just simply not true. And this is a good example of that, because they eat from the right tree at the beginning of this chapter, and then they take from the wrong tree by its end. Does that make sense? You good? Okay. All right. So now, man, I've got a lot going on this slide, not just when all these blocks, but we're reading through 3 chapters here too. I'm not really going to be reading all 3, but we're going to be drawing from Numbers 22, 23, and 24 because the whole story of Balam and his donkey get up in this. But before we do that, I want to read this first. This comes from outside the Scriptures, and so when it comes to trying to understand the Bible better, We have to be careful, of course, when we're using extra biblical resources and whatnot, because that can always create problems as much as it can solve. But having said that, this might be one that helps us better understand one of the greatest enigmas of this story, and that is, so was Balaam a real prophet of God? Or was he some cultic figure out there that God just kind of like the whole witch at Endor with Saul and Samuel kind of thing, who's totally talking to the dead or whatever she was doing until Saul comes through her tent door and says, I need to talk to this guy. You need to bring him up for me. And then she gets scared out of her mind when Samuel comes up from whatever pool or thing or whatever that medium was that she was using to actually become a conduit through which the dead could talk. But, of course, the Lord uses that in the moment to transmit a message from a dead prophet to an almost dead king that this is my final verdict on you and you just need to prepare yourself. This could be the truth for Balaam too. Whatever he was before this moment when Yahweh speaks to and through him, we don't know. But maybe this can shed some light on this. So the Der Allah inscription, dated to roughly 700-800-ish BC, so that's still about 700 or 800 years off from the time frame this would be occurring in. So maybe the dating's wrong, or maybe this is just a later recantation of it that people are writing down. Again, in a completely oral society at that time, when people are still passing around stories and finding things to write it on, this may be a very well-preserved memory. But notice I've highlighted some of the things here for you. The misfortunes of the book of Balaam, son of Beor. So we know from the context of this story, it's the same figure. A divine seer was he. The gods came to him at night. And so from this, it would seem like, he is a servant of a pantheon of gods. Don't know. And he beheld a vision in accordance with El's utterance. Now, why should that term El seem familiar to us? Exactly. Because when we are looking at Semitic, not just Hebrew, but Semitic languages, this is a common term that's used for God. In fact, in the storyline of the pantheon of gods that most of these ancient Near Eastern civilizations serve, the most predominant pantheon is the one that Baal rules over. But Baal, though he is the chief of the gods, more or less like the Zeus figure, yet he did not create himself. He was spawned or progenited from another or elder god. He is the son of El. So, of course, this leads to all sorts of conspiracies and whatnot with respect to the idea or skeptical viewpoints that Israel as a nation did not come from Egypt, that they were just basically born out of all the various Canaanite and Amorite peoples that were already living indigenous to the land, and then kind of added their own spin to the stories of El and whatnot, but taking on that name for their God as well, or maybe originally was worshiping him and then created a whole different cultic expression of how they would worship the same God, and then later on they divorce it from that El and then make a whole new El and then add other names to it such as Shaddai or Elyon or whatever else to qualify who they're speaking about or who this is. Anyway, and they said to Balaam, son of Beor, so it will be with not surviving. No one has seen the likes of what you have heard. So it sounds like something bad. Then his intimates entered into his presence, so women, and they said to Balaam, son of Beor, why do you fast and why do you weep? So he's emotionally moved. Then he said to them, be seated. I will relate to you what the Shaddai gods have planned. El Shaddai, the Almighty, as translated for us in English, would be just a way of saying the one who sits at the top of whatever this hierarchy is. The gods have band together. The Shaddai gods have established a council. Again, a whole other hour could be spent talking about the divine council, but we've sowed the seeds for that along the way in various texts that we've already looked at to understand there is such a biblical concept as a divine council, and the Ben Ha-Elohim, or the sons of God, these other spiritual entities that are not God, but then he shares his authority with, because that's just part of what he assumes to do. It's not a pantheon of gods, and they are not gods. They are not God, obviously. They are created beings. So we're not looking at a sense of a polytheistic expression of Israel's religion or anything like that, but it parallels in lots of ways to what's going on. Now, you wonder why I bring this up. Because when we look at some of these passages, like Numbers 22:13, here, and that's the top verse I have for you here. And Yahweh said to the princes or leaders of Balak, "Go back to your land." So this is Balaam speaking to them, and he gives the name here of God, the very God that Israel worships, and the message he has sent through Balaam to Balak, the king of Moab, to tell these messengers he has sent to get Balaam. God has told Balaam, "You can't go." Tell the messengers to just go back to Balak. When he says what we read in English as God, he gives the name Yahweh. Not a surprise. Okay, so then we go to 23 verse 8. Here is part of one of his poems. "How can I curse someone God has not cursed? How can I denounce someone the Lord has not denounced?" So now you go to this middle verse here on the screen. I'll give you a portion of that. "Has refused Yahweh," because in lots of ways, Hebrew's kind of written somewhat backward, but if we read it the right way, "Yahweh has refused to give me permission to go with you." I'm sorry, that's not the right one. The third one. How shall I curse not whom God has cursed, and how shall I denounce?" But notice the term for God here. It's not Yahweh. What is it? Can you see it? Right up there. What's right above my red dot? El. He there calls God El. This is one of about half a dozen times in all of his oracles and poems and various words where he uses the word God, but he does not use Yahweh. He uses El. What did we just read in the Durala inscription? That he is talking about when he is telling his intimate partners, "This is why my face is disfigured and I'm weeping and fasting and whatnot, because I'll tell you what the gods, El and his Shaddai council, have told me." Okay? So all that to say, maybe a part of what's going on here is that Balaam knows who Yahweh is. He knows the God of this people. But he is also in some ways relating this to the God that he serves. That's, in the immortal words of Forrest Gump, that's all I'm going to say about that. Because I'm going to lose track of time, and I think we pretty much got the idea. So anyway, the idea, and the same thing here, I'll just point this out real quick. Right there, the very last word on this corner of the screen right here, "The utterance of him who hears the words of God, the vision of the Almighty," Shaddai. So that pairs over here too with that, just to make sure we make that connection. So he's using terms that would be simple and familiar to him from what he already calls the gods that he perhaps speaks of or to, from, whatever. Okay, so this is another spot where we're looking at passages from both Numbers and Deuteronomy to get a fuller sense of what's going on here. So in the orange box, we're about to read this here in just a second. So verses 1 through 12 of Numbers 22. "The Israelites traveled on, camped in the plains of Moab near the Jordan." So if this is the Jordan, you've got two important rivers here, the Arnon and the Jabbok, and this is the territory of Sihon. This is Moab, and then by the time you get up here, that's Og, and these are all Amorites, and then you've got Ammonites living out here. Now, all of these are going to be set aside for destruction. Moab is going to be a special circumstance, and we'll perhaps find out why here in just a second. So they're on the plains of Moab, near Jordan, across from Jericho, which is about right there. And now Balak, verse 2, "Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was terrified of the people because they were numerous, and Moab dreaded the Israelites. So the Moabites said to the elders of Midian, 'This horde will devour everything around us, like an ox eats up the green plants in the field.' Since Balak, son of Zippor, was Moab's king at that time, he sent messengers to Balam, son of Beor, at Pethor, which is by the way of the Euphrates, in the land of his people." So if I was going to draw on the wall, Euphrates is all the way up there. Okay, so it's a long way for him to get there and get this message to him. "Balak said to him, 'Look, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the surface of the land. They are living right across from me. Please come and put a curse on these people for me, because they are more powerful than I am. I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that those you bless are blessed and those you curse are cursed.'" This creates another question. Do these old world occultic curses and blessings really have any stock? We might ask, okay, what's the importance of even looking at something like this? Because in all honesty, we know this is just fake stuff. It's all superstitious. I mean, why would any of this even matter? because they could just be speaking words, but nobody's going to be there to honor it. There are no gods other than God. So if there's no real such thing as black magic or any of that stuff, they can sacrifice all the animals they want to. They can divine through reading livers and entrails and whatever else. It ain't going to make a difference because God is not going to honor anything that Balaam says to curse these people. That might not be entirely true. Okay? Again, when it comes to the spiritual realm and what is unseen and unknown to us is not a taboo thing for us to talk about, but we have to do so within a biblical frame of reference. We don't have the time to fully develop that. But suffice it to say, there are occultic powers at play that perhaps could be invoked to cause a disturbance, and God is going to step in to prevent that. That is all I'll say with respect to that. Okay, now, moving on. So the elders of Midian, in verse 7, and Moab departed with fees for divination in hand. They came to Balaam, reported Balak's words to him. He said to them, spend the night here, and I will give you the answer the Lord tells me. So the officials of Moab stayed with Balaam. Then God came to Balaam and asked, who are these men with you? As if to say God doesn't know. Of course he does. It's like a Genesis 3 context question of, Adam, where are you? He knows where Adam is. So the officials of Moab stayed with Balaam. Verse 10, Balaam replied to God, Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent this message to me. Look, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the surface of the land. Now come, put a curse on them for me. I may be able to fight against them and drive them away. Then God said to Balaam, you are not to go with them, and you are not to curse this people. We'll stop there for a second. Let's look at the Deuteronomy text from Deuteronomy 2, right there in the purple box. Moses says, so we bypassed our brothers, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir, telling us about this phase of the journey. We turned away from the Arabah road and from Elath and Ezion-Geber, and we traveled along the road to the wilderness of Moab. The Lord said to me, show no hostility toward Moab. Do not provoke them to battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, since I have given Ar as a possession to the Lot's or descendants of Lot. Because Moab is one of the children of the incestuous relationship he had with his daughters. But because Lot is a nephew of Abraham, then he gets this kind of extra dispensational, and I don't mean a theological construct, I just mean an economy, a special allowance from God, just like Edom does, the people of Esau. God is not going to let them have this. He's not going to let them have that. That is permanently set aside for Moab's descendants. Now, the Amorites and Ammonites to the north, that's free game. Having said that, the important thing to remember here is there's a big complex picture, a massive throng of 1 million plus, maybe even 2 million people here that's so big that neither Balak nor Balaam gets the full picture at any point where they go up to see them from. They only get to see a portion of them. With that in mind, what's going on down here is Balak thinks them a threat and is willing to do whatever. Probably wouldn't stop it short of, sacrificing one of his own children for the sake of victory if that's what Balaam told him he had to do. And yet God has already told these people, you can't touch them. You would think a simple conversation would have hashed this out, but not. Anyway, and of course these people are down on the floor, or the valley floor, while Balak and Balaam are up on the mountaintops trying to get this whole thing going on. Okay. So then what winds up happening, I'm going to go to verses 7 through 10 in Numbers 23 in just a second, but to kind of summarize what's transitioning us from 22 to 23, Balak takes Balaam to several high places. Again, Genesis prologue. The man is to serve and rule on the cosmic mountain. And we're thinking of the cosmic mountain with the garden on the top. Terrible kindergarten drawings, I know, but that's it. That's the garden temple. Man, he's there serving as God's image bearer. Do you think it's coincidence? And probably this is the way that we read the story most of the time. Well, to get the best synopsis of who Israel is and to keep this somewhat shrouded so Israel can't see what's going on, being up on these high places, these mountains and hills, would make this possible. Oh, come on now. That's thinking without appreciating the rest of the context. Because in every one of these high places, Balaam gives Balak the instructions, which I'm sure the king didn't do it. He told men to build 7 altars And on these altars, they are going to kill a bull and a ram on every one of them. And they do this 3 separate times. When you have nothing out here but flat plains and a few sparse mountainous type hills, you don't think they saw the smoke? Of course they did. So they're not keeping anything under cover. What is this about then? It's about them going up to sacred sites. In fact, the very first place is Bamoth Baal, which if translated literally into English means the high place of Baal. It's a place of worship, the very first spot where 7 fresh altars are going to be built. And, oh, by the way, the offerings that are going to be offered as a type or a category is the olah. What is the olah offering? Burnt. Now, in the worship of Yahweh, we've talked about how in this cultic sense, that is to ascend through the smoke up into Yahweh's presence at the summit of the cosmic mountain to worship with Him through the identification of oneself with the animal. But that arises from centuries worth of man already offering burnt offerings to these other gods. So this would be in a context that Balak and Balaam both can appreciate, which is still probably the most intimate form of expression that one can give themselves over to in worshiping their gods. So it is truly an attempt to try to invoke on Balaam's part Yahweh, the God of Israel, because that's what he says to Balak. I'm going to get an answer from him for you. So he, in this whole cosmic mountain sense, is on 7, not 1, 3, or 5, 7 total altars to give it the best possible chance of success, going to try to go into Yahweh's presence and get an answer for you. And the answer is always no. And we'll get into some of that in a second. But anyway, the next one is the summit of Mount Pisgah, then the summit of Beor, overlooking Jeshimon, or what's called the wasteland. So 3 different sites, and not a coincidence it's 3 either. But anyway, what ultimately is happening in all of this, though, is that the serpent is at work. The serpent is at work through Balak, attempting to try to get a curse brought down, externally speaking, as an existential force on God's people, and God shuts that down. Now, what we need to see as a bigger part of the story, because how this whole thing ends, is Israel does not win. Instead, as they have already several times, they rue the day. Paradoxically, God is up on the mountain working to protect them and to keep them from getting cursed. And when it's all said and done, Balaam finds a sly way to make it happen outside of speaking an occultic curse on them. And then we go back to the Genesis 3 context. We always ask this age-old question, why didn't God just keep the snake out of the garden in the first place? But what we see often is that God allows trial to be experienced on the part of the image bearers because wisdom lies in front of them. And they have to make the grown-up choice. Which tree do you eat from? We'll explore that here in just a bit. But then when we look at Balaam's blessings, let's read some of those. Numbers 23, 7 through 10. Balaam proclaimed this poem. There is a people living alone. I'm not reading all of it. I'm just reading a portion of it because we don't have the time. Reading some verse 9 and on to 10. There is a people living alone. It does not consider itself amongst the nations because it's holy. Who has counted the dust of Jacob or numbered even 1/4 of Israel? He's speaking about a plentiful people, is he not? So would you say then, if everybody has to start from 1, and now we have so many that you can't even see them all in the scope or field of your vision from where you're standing, what has carried them from their originator or ancestor to who they are now? Mathematically, we would say this process is one of, thinking of a word that starts with M, multiplication. And that takes us back to the context of Genesis 1 in the garden. He blessed first the field, or the beasts of the field, then the image bearers to what? Be and multiply. So God has carried this about. And I only had enough space in that box on the right side to say Adam's blessing, but I want you to look past that, and I want you to see in every one of those, this is dualistic. It's both Adam's and Abraham's blessing. Moving beyond, and of course you could say with that, they are a blessed people as well. Then we go to verses 18 through 24 of 23, which is the next poem. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he might change his mind. Does he speak and not act, or promise and not fulfill? I have indeed received a command to bless. Since he has blessed, I cannot change it. Now we go to Numbers 24, verses 3 through 9. He proclaimed yet the next poem, the oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eyes are open, the oracle of one who hears the sayings of God and sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls into a trance. Now, Just as a side note, that whole Dear Allah inscription, he speaks of falling into a trance. So here we have yet another point of connection with that. Just wanted to say for all you real nerds out there who are like, I'm looking for those things. Anyway, the oracle, the one who hears the sayings of God, falls into a trance. Eyes are uncovered. Verse 5, how beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwellings, Israel. They stretch out like river valleys, like gardens beside a stream. There's our context clue. I was going to ask the question, but I think you've seen it. Like aloes the Lord has planted, like cedars beside the water. Water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be abundant by water. His king will be greater than Agag. I'll point out the significance of that in a second. His king will be exalted. God brought him out of Egypt. Speaking of the Exodus, which is a migratory pattern from exile to the new provincial Eden space where new creation is going to begin. The whole Eden experiment from Genesis 1 through 3 all getting kicked off in this new space that God has promised to Abraham and his people. We always need to keep that in mind when we hear references to the Exodus out of Egypt. And then verse 9, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. Where have we heard that before? I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Who said that to who? Right, to Abram, exactly. So we're seeing the beginning phases of that covenant, which is really the Genesis 1 covenant. Be fruitful, multiply. I will make you a great nation. Connecting the points tangentially, it goes on to say, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Not something God said to Adam, but expanding that covenant now, considering a nation is going to be born from this man named Abram. Backing that up a bit, though, considering the idea that he describes them as stretching out like rivers, go back to the Eden 2 context. Here we have in Eden a rivering through the garden that then does what? Splits, and it becomes the source of 4 rivers, stretches out. And we have nation groups that don't even exist yet being mentioned as part of that context, speaking about how the blessings of Eden will go out of this garden space to touch the nations. Same thing here. They're going to stretch out like rivers. God's going to plant them in this space, and as a vine tentacles out on the trellis, so will they. And again, he unwittingly invokes the blessing that God gives to Abram. Now, it's important for us to recognize the reason why we have this mention of Agag here. Anybody offhand know who Agag even is? He is. He is the king of who particularly? The Amalekites. So it seems to be a title of their king, like Pharaoh is of king over Egypt, because this name is used many times over. But when the Amalekites came against the Israelites on their way to Sinai, that whole battle with Joshua and Moses, hands up kind of thing, raising the roof, then we have God making a proclamation through Moses. Joshua, write this down. Make sure all generations know this. The Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Yet we don't find any wars happening with the next generation, with Amalek, or the generation after that. We really won't find a significant battle happening again until David comes along 500 years later almost. Well, Saul around that time too. So Saul and then David. And then, of course, the Amalekites are virtually annihilated at that point. But nonetheless, another Agag is the one who was slain by Samuel because Saul didn't have the guts to do it. But that aside, if there has been no perpetual generational war between them, what does God mean? What is the significance of saying the Lord will be at war with Amalek? Well, Amalek came and attacked Israel on their way to his mountain, Sinai, where they are going to go meet with God at sacred space. Genesis prologue, who's attempting to try to attack God's people as they meet with him in sacred space? The serpent. So Amalek in this sense, just like Pharaoh did down in Egypt, Amalek now represents in that contextual framework of that story paired with the Genesis prologue, Agag and the Amalekites are who? The serpent. So God is saying, he's just announcing it. And basically you could sub it out. God is going to be at war with the serpent and the people of the serpent, generation after generation. It shifts when it gets into the land of Canaan. Amalekites aren't there. It's everybody else who are the Amorites and whateverites. Then it becomes the Philistines and on, right? Goliath there standing in front of Jacob. So again, it's the serpent attempting to be the most cunning, but in this sense, God is protecting his people. And then we go on to the messianic promise of Numbers 4, which 24, 15 through 19. Then Balaam proclaims this last and final poem. The oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eyes are open, the oracle of the one who hears the sayings of God, his knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls into a trance with his eyes uncovered. So yeah, repeating a lot of the same stuff. I see him, but not now. I perceive him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. There is no doubt from New Testament references that this is indeed speaking ultimately of Jesus, but in the near context, it's speaking of David also. Because he will smash the forehead of Moab, strike down all the Shephites. Edom will become a possession. Seir will become a possession of his enemies, but Israel will become triumphant. One who comes from Jacob will rule when he will destroy the city's survivors. Because in David's day, he does this. He subdues both Moab and Edom, stripped them of their king. They become tributaries to him, vassal nations that he rules over. Does not go in and necessarily colonize, but he does set up garrisons and outposts. And again, they pay him tribute generation after generation, even to many of his sons for hundreds of years afterwards until they eventually become so weak they can't continue to hold on to them. Anyway, so this leads us to our next to last slide, but our last slide is pretty quick, so we'll get some time to kind of camp out here a little bit. Numbers 25, 1 through 13. While Israel was staying in the acacia grove, the people began to prostitute themselves with the women of Moab. So here in Numbers 22 through 23, scene after scene, Balak trying to work through Balaam, getting super frustrated with every turn in the bend because Balaam is just not complying. Hey, fine then, don't bless them, but don't curse them, but don't bless them either. And then finally, did I not tell you to stop blessing them? And then that is all you've done. And I'm paying you for this, for crying out loud. And so he just gets frustrated and walks away. That's after the third oracle. Balaam throws in two more just for the fun of it to add in some more theology for us all about who Israel is and how God is going to use them. He's redeemed them for this purpose and what his plans are. But then when we shift the frame from the high places back down to the flat plains where Israel is, and Balaam has now whispered into the ears of Balak, fine, hey, man, I'm sorry. I told you from the get-go, you really can't be mad at me. I warned you. I can only say what he says I can say. I've done that. But there is a way around all this. So what really gets to every man's heart? A nice, warm fried chicken dinner? Come on, Balak, you're a king. You know what it takes. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm smelling what you're putting down. So the next thing you know, Midianite and Moabite women find themselves sauntering on into the camp of the Israelites. And here's what they do. They invite them, verse 2, to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down and worshiped to their gods. So Israel aligned itself with Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger might turn away from Israel. So Moses told Israel's judges, kill each of the men who aligned themselves with Baal of Peor. An Israelite man came bringing a Midianite woman to his relatives in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite community while they were weeping at the entrance at the tent of meeting. So here they are, Ohel Moed. They're right there at the entrance. They're all crying out loud because of the sin of what's going on here and the execution of family members and loved ones who are co-conspirators in this. And yet you've got one guy who has the audacity to take a Midianite woman. Most scholars render this as basically trying to take her into his mother's tent. That sounds weird, but look at the Song of Songs. It's not an uncommon thing for a nomadic society at the time of the wedding consummation event to happen, for the tent that the bridegroom was conceived in would be the very place he's going to consummate his marriage. You're like, that's gross because my parents sleep there. That's true. Totally different time, totally different society. Understand that that's how it works. That's what's going on here. They know the audacity of what he's about to do. Totally insensitive, considering the context of what's going on here. And then we see how this is responded to by Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, verse 7, son of Aaron the priest. So Aaron's grandson saw this. He got up from the assembly, took a spear in his hand, followed the Israelite man into the tent, drove it through both the Israelite man and the woman, through their belly. Then the plague on the Israelites was stopped. That's interesting, because we saw this at work last week. We saw this when Korah's rebellion happened. And here, when the people get all stirred up, after the ground cracked open and swallowed up 250 people and all their possessions alive, they go accuse Moses and Aaron of killing the people. And so God wants to strike them all dead. And Moses immediately in haste turns to Aaron and says, go fill your fire pan with coals and incense and run out into the middle of the people because plague is already setting in. Looks like a wave of death probably just, causing people to collapse left and right while Aaron is trying his best to get hot coals and incense in a fire pan and run out to the middle of them. And when he finally advances past the line of death, we have a stark contrast of 14,700 dead bodies and thousands more who are alive, who were just seconds away from death. And the only thing that stopped them was, as Moses says, the one standing between them who atones for, expiates their sin, saves them. Here we have the same thing. In this, we have Phinehas atoning for the sin. Remember, as I referenced before when we were going through Leviticus 1 through 7, atonement has a much broader concept in lots of other contexts than just blood is spilt from an animal that is meant to expiate my sin in whatever context that is. Because in neither of those cases, with Aaron or his grandson, making atonement for people and life and death hanging in the balance is blood spilt from an animal in the form of a sacrifice. It's a person standing in the gap who stops God's wrath. Now that has a much broader biblical application than just animal on an altar and shedding blood, which I'm not trying to undercut that. I'm just saying we need to look at this for all that it's worth. All right, but anyway, verse 10, the Lord spoke to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites because he was zealous among them with my zeal, so that I did not destroy the Israelites in my zeal. Therefore I declare, I grant my covenant of peace with him, and it will be my covenant of perpetual priesthood to him for his future descendants, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. So back to the Genesis prologue. They are to eat from any tree in the garden, but not the tree of Tov and Ra. So they are given instruction, Torah wisdom already. You are not to bow to any other god. What does the serpent coerce Balaam to do to use Balak as an instrument for in getting these cultic shrine prostitutes to go out and then conspire with Israel to achieve? Getting them to bow down to other gods. Why does God let the snake go into the garden? Because they have to make the grown-up choice. I've given you wisdom. You have to choose to follow that or do what you think is wise in your own eyes, but be prepared to reap the consequences. God promised in the very first prologue of Scripture, or the mention of that, death will ensue. It's not a surprise here. Death will ensue. Take the leaders, execute them. Man, that sounds really harsh. Not even a chance to repent and apologize, to face down what they did and turn away from it. Why are we surprised? Humans in the garden, same thing. The blue boxes are the common theme amongst all of them. That is, they have the wisdom of Yahweh, or they have the chance to have wisdom. Notice that's wisdom without Yahweh. They eat the fruit. They get exiled. Same thing with Israel at Sinai with the calf. Do not make any other gods before me. God spoke that from the mountain in their presence. It's not Moses up there writing it on a tablet and, oh man, if you had just waited 5 minutes, I had some instructions here for you not to do that. Oh man, you totally messed up. But that's kind of my fault because you didn't know. No, they knew. They heard from God's own mouth, from the fire and smoke on the mountain. Do not do this. They choose what's wise in their own eyes. The people who made the thing, about 3,000 of them died immediately when Moses sent out Levites to go kill them all. Then we go up to Numbers 13 and 14. Here they are on the precipice of the land. 2 spies say, yes, we've got this. Oh, I can't wait to go in and conquer the land. And the other 10 are like, listen here, we're all grasshoppers. They're going to squash us. And because they stir up this frenzy that leads to this murderous rage of wanting to kill Moses and just go back and give themselves to endless perpetual slavery, God kills those 10 men that started that immediately. The rest of them wander for 40 years. God puts those men to death instantaneously. And then as we just spoke about Korah in the wilderness, Korah led that procession, but all 250 that come present fire pans with him saying, we want the priesthood that belongs only to Aaron, God kills them immediately. But notice what happens in the aftermath. They stirred up the whole community into dissension yet again, hence the reason God brings this down on their heads. The whole community is responsible now for going and prostituting themselves with cultic shrine prostitutes. Not surprising them that God would hold some people responsible for making this decision accountable and have them put to death. Again, the serpent clearly at work. And then we have another thing going on here, where they're told no Israelite is to be a cult prostitute, which you would think an extension of that would be you're not to engage with these people. They prostitute themselves with the women of Moab, hence take the leaders, have them executed. So again, what we're supposed to appreciate in all of this, with the reiteration of the Genesis prologue, is that Torah has already been given that has spoke to every one of these circumstances, and we see yet again, in totally different contexts, they continue to choose the wrong thing. They continue to take a bite from the wrong tree. Except for that one moment where it was like, King of Arad, hey, if you will fight for us, we'll do exactly what you want. God's on our side. Let's go. Why can't it be like that all the time? And we see the disproportional ratio of how many times they foul things up versus actually wanting to partner with God, and how much easier this journey would have been had they just done that. And then we cap this off with what kind of neatly bookends this little section with them numbering the people yet again. So this is a natural line of demarcation in the book, because the first chapter was counting the people again for the purpose of a military census. And then in Numbers 2, we have a Levitical census to give us an idea of how robust the priesthood would be and settle the difference between the transitioning of all the firstborn males are supposed to be priests, but God is now substituting them out for the Levites, but it has to be a one-for-one exchange. More firstborn than Levites make up the difference by every additional firstborn male, redeem them back, buy them from the slavery of priesthood, 5 shekels for every head. But now in this one chapter, we've got this condensed down into both an Israelite and Levitical priesthood, clan by clan. And so what we see in some of this, and I've highlighted this in red for you in those boxes on the right side of the screen versus the original snapshot. The picture in the middle is what the original numbers were from Numbers 2 context. But let's read some verses from Numbers 26. Oh, let me explain that. Numbers in red. Numbers in red are the tribes that have decreased in quantity. And this is really, really fascinating right here. When you consider the idea of Simeon's tribe, let me get my little laser pointer up here. Look at Simeon's tribe in the Numbers 2 census, 59,000. Now they're down to 22. Now you might be wondering why. They must have got to hold some bad chicken or something. But remember what God is saying through Jacob, their progenitor, in Genesis 29. Simeon and Levi co-conspiring with each other to destroy the people of Shechem because of the rape of their sister Dinah, whatever. And he says to them, they will be dispersed. Tribes of Levi will have no inheritance, and they will truly be dispersed. Simeon now seems to be fading away. In one generation, he is cut in less than half. There's got to be something to that. There's not a coincidence. Anyway, let's read some verses here. Verses 1 through 4. After the plague, the Lord said to Moses and Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, take a census of the entire Israelite community by their ancestral families of those 20 years old or more who can serve in Israel's army. So Moses and the priest Eleazar said to them in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. So now we're at the staging ground, right where we're supposed to be. Take a census of those 20 years old or more, as the Lord had commanded Moses and the Israelites who came out of the land of Egypt. Now, down to verse 52. The Lord spoke to Moses, the land is to be divided among them as an inheritance based on the number of names. Increase the inheritance for a large tribe and decrease it for a small one. So that begs the question then, considering the difference of the numbering of these tribes from Numbers 2 till now, Numbers 20, or Numbers 26, what would this have looked like had they went into the land in Numbers 13? Judah was already a big tribe, so they probably still would have got a bigger inheritance. But the allotments to some of these other tribes probably would have looked vastly different in comparison. Anyway, each is to be given its inheritance according to those who were registered in it. The land is to be divided by lot. They will receive an inheritance according to the names of their ancestral tribes. Each inheritance will be divided by lot among the larger and smaller tribes. Now to verses 63 through 65. These were the ones registered by Moses and the priest Eleazar when they registered the Israelites on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. But among them there was not one of those who had been registered by Moses and the priest Aaron. How sad is that? This tragedy has become real. Not a single head they counted was among them that were 38 years ago when they did this the first time. They're all dead. For the Lord had said to them that they would all die in the wilderness. None of them was left except Caleb of Jephunneh and Joshua, son of Nun. So, with that in mind, any concluding thoughts or comments, questions? I'm actually finishing 4 minutes early rather than 5 minutes over, so we got plenty of time for talk. Any comments or insights on how the Genesis prologue plays into this? Maybe something that you've seen that you didn't see before that you're like, wow, that kind of stands out now, or I don't know, that doesn't quite sound kosher to me. So how can we clear that up?
The idea of the atonement,
Mhm.
that's kind of wishy-washy a little bit still. Because we kind of talked about it before, and don't really see a picture of atonement for sin, for intentional sin.
Right. Exactly.
But here, this was intentional sin.
Ah.
You see what I mean?
Exactly. I do. I think I do. Let me walk with you on this and see if I'm understanding and tracking with you. So yeah, you're right. When we were going back to, or first talking about Leviticus 4 and the idea of a sin offering, a katah, which also doubles as purification, but multiple times in the context of that passage, we are told it's for unintentional sin. And we are told what happens with deliberate high-handed sins, which not too long ago, Numbers 15, after one of these cycles of rebellion, basically what happened in Numbers 13 and 14, with them rejecting the Exodus, we have God reiterating the same thing, a promise of, hey, when you go into the land, so he just rejected that generation and said they're all going to die, but then he gives more Torah about when you go into the land, so he's not completely done with them. But nonetheless, he speaks about when you sin unintentionally, and this is how you are to give these offerings, and then he specifies a little bit more about how much grain are you to offer in the minha offering and how much wine in the nesek offering and whatnot. But then he reiterates, but anyone who sins with a high hand, meaning in defiance, do what I want, that person, they are to be held accountable when their guilt stays on them. They are to be dealt with, executed. And right after that, we got the circumstance of the guy picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And he's doing this knowing that he's violating the Sabbath, and he doesn't care. And so he then is brought before the Lord, and the Lord gives the verdict of he is to be put to death in front of the whole community. So all that into these contexts of Aaron being told by Moses, because he didn't act on his own. But then again, consider what Moses did in Exodus 32 on through 34. Because there we've got the people all doing their thing around the golden calf. And then Moses brings judgment. God wants to annihilate them all, but it is only a fraction of the people. But then Moses says, I'm going back up the mountain, see if I can atone for your sins. He doesn't tell them, even though before he walked up the mountain, he gave instructions. Because maybe he knows how long he's going to be gone, maybe he doesn't. But he says, if you are going to give a sacrifice, even though no regulatory instruction has been given yet, you are to make an altar out of uncut stones with an earth ramp up to it. So presumably they are being given the license now to make sacrifices. If you want to kill your livestock in the form of a burnt offering, which they perhaps would have known some idea of how to do, you can do that while Moses is up on the mountain. But when Moses goes up on the mountain, he pleads that the Lord would forgive them. And he says, if you will not blot out their sin, then blot me out of your book. He puts himself on the line. Me in exchange for them. Now, we're never told that atonement is given in the sense that the sin is expiated. They are pardoned, but they still have to deal with the consequence. 3,000 have already died. And then they get more Torah on top of that. Then we get into this with Aaron going out there and the line of death stops. He made atonement, but he didn't shed a drop of blood. How did he expiate their sin? All I can really say with respect to that is that because he substitutes himself in place of this and he goes out and is willing to stand, imagine that. You have no idea what is causing people to drop like flies. And it's going from one side of the people to the next in this linear fashion. Why in the world would you go out there and stand in front of that? The thing that probably would be looming large in the back of any of our minds is because I'm not the one that stepped up and decided to do that. Somebody else is telling me to because of the role that I'm in. I don't want to do that. What if that gets me and I die? I don't want to die. But you're willing to die, hence the reason you're going to go out there and stand in the gap. So now we have two instances where it's not the blood of an animal, it is a person standing in the gap. And yet in the Exodus 33-34 context, God does not completely chase away their sin. We have no language being given as far as the east is from the west, like Jeremiah, and speaking of the Messianic era and the New Covenant. And again, a person, per Isaiah 53 language, being the one who stands in the gap. He takes the chastisement the people deserve on himself. Through his stripes, they will be healed, not because of anything that they do. And the same thing here with Phineas, although it's a totally different circumstance. It's not, granted it's plague, people are dying, people have already been executed, but he does act on his own. He just goes, skewers these two people. What he was thinking, don't know, but it led to a moment where God honors that, an act of almost vengefulness. But nonetheless, it is zeal that God calls him out for and commends him over, and he expiates the sin, stops the plague, simply by virtue of the fact that he seems to be willing to do what God is already shown himself willing to do multiple times in previous or past precedents. That God is willing to execute or bring wrath down on the person who's willing to sin with a high hand. Now you're like, well, what does that have to do with atonement? Well, in no picture in which atonement is involved can we explain atonement without some measure of wrath and judgment being involved. No offerer gets to come and bring in a law without the context in place of, I don't deserve to be here. I should be the animal consumed in the flames. There is a picture of wrath and judgment, but it's not to forgive them of all sin that they've committed, hence the animal's atoning action over them when they shed its blood. So now a third example of a person willing to stand in the gap and offer themselves up in the place of. But that takes a little bit more working in Phineas' example than it does in the other two. I think those are easier to see. The Phineas thing is one of those things where I think just kind of have to twist the Rubik's Cube a bit more and line a few other things up to see that. But the beautiful thing is that when you read that, assuming you're moving from Genesis 1 all the way up here till Numbers 25, that you're not supposed to have a complete picture of what that means. You're not supposed to walk away from Numbers 25 thinking, yes, got that. That's Jesus. Don't try to misconstrue things or overinflate things either. Let's move forward. And as we move forward, it may be well outside the Torah before we get to a moment where we see other people riffing off that idea and starting to build. And we might not even realize how that works because Phineas' name might not be mentioned, Levites might not be mentioned, none of that stuff. So we have to kind of pay more attention to the context clues to see how do these fit together to understand this is how this puzzle works and how Jesus can look at all these stories to the two disciples on the Emmaus Road and say, that was me all along. So I hope that answers your question in some way, albeit it might not fully clear up and explain to you in a very succinct way. This is exactly how atonement works in those situations, because I don't think we can, with a concise, operative definition of atonement that fits every context. Anything else? With that, have I further confused anybody? We all good? Okay.